This is the awkward part where I wait until people get on. We'll see how it goes. If you're watching this in the future, know that I'm waiting for people to jump on. Oh, perfect! People, hello! Oh, and it's my friends. Hi, guys! Hello, welcome. Welcome to our first weekly literary hour. So I'm going to go through everything at the beginning, and then the way this works is I'm Katherine. I'm a bookseller here at Trident. I guess not here. Right now I'm at my house. And I am also the social media person. This is our first weekly literary cocktail hour. And I say this is our first weekly one because technically we did these all of last week for the virtual bookstore party. So the way this works is I'm going to make a cocktail and then I'm going to talk about books for however long I get to talk about books. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to jump in and say whatever you want. If you have questions, if you want recommendations, anything like that, jump in. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk and monologue about books for however long. Today, we're talking about Folklore and Fairytales. Hello! Hello, everybody. The cocktail I'm making today, I don't know how it's going to go because all the cocktails I make here are just things that I have in my house or can get access to. So these are all quarantine cocktails. This is something I found online called a fairy tale, so I thought it would be fitting. It might just be bad. Technically, it is supposed to be made with white chocolate sauce, but first of all, I hate white chocolate, and second of all, I didn't have it. So I have regular chocolate sauce, and I've got some milk as a base, which is also fine according to Google, so we'll see how that goes. So I'm mixing everything together. Probably I should do this in a shaker, but I don't have a shaker because I'm not a fancy bar person. So that's, the way it is. Your favorite quarantine cocktail is straight vodka. How topical, because the next thing that I put in here is vodka. Straight vodka is a good quarantine cocktail, though. Sometimes that's the way it has to go. I'm going to use this little baby shot glass to measure it out because it's very cute. And also, I couldn't find the jigger that I usually use. So sometimes that's the way it goes here in quarantine. That's that, so some vodka. And then it also says to add strawberries. I don't necessarily have real strawberries. I do, however, have strawberry sauce that I made because I made biscuits the other day. So if you want to know how to make strawberry sauce, it's really easy. You just need cut up strawberries and water and sugar and a little bit of cornstarch. It's so simple. You guys can do it at home. I did it at home. Goes great on shortbread cookies or biscuits or crepes or whatever you have, Like I said, usually you would probably want to, I'm mixing it up right now, not very well. Usually you would probably want to use hold on one second, a shaker. That is not what I have, but I was just handed a spoon, so I'm gonna actually mix it. Erin says this is either going to be delicious or horrendous. You're correct. I'm the one drinking it though, so I guess we'll see. Are you in a garden now? Thank you, Brittany. Anyway, I hope you are all drinking at home because we should all be drinking with your drink of choice. Oh, it looks kind of like chocolate milk. We'll see how this goes. You know what? It's not bad. So, I'm as shocked as you are. It's not bad. Anyway, I have made my drink. Doesn't look great though, so it's not very pretty, but we'll see how it goes. And anyways, I'm gonna start talking about Folklore and Fairytales. Feel free to jump in with any questions, comments, concerns you may have. I have a pile of books here. If nobody has questions, I'm going to go through this whole pile of books and just rant, which I'm good at. So, what's the drink called? According to Google, it's called a fairy tale. So, on theme. All right, so to start off with fairy tales, we've got also prefacing this by saying everything that you see is going to be superimposed because I don't know how to fix it. I'm sorry. Starting it off by talking about just the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. This one is done by Philip Pullman. It's super excellent. Great take on like traditional fairy tales. Fairy tales are very fun. Which is why I'm talking about them today. I did a poll and everybody said this is what I should talk about, and you were all right. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is retellings though, so keep an eye out for that. Next, we have Tales of the Beetle and the Bard by J.K. Rowling. I'm sure you all know about this book. I love anyone who can invent their own fairy tales. I think fairy tales are so fun, and coming up with new ones is always great. Leigh Bardugo also has a book called Language of Thorns, I believe, which is like all invented fairy tales. They're so much fun. Any like new take on fairy tales is my favorite thing. Speaking of, if you talk about, like, the way fairy tales are traditionally thought about, usually what you actually end up thinking about is stuff the Victorians do. For those of you who can't see, this is Victorian fairy tales. This is the Oxford Classics edition. Victorians really, like, a lot of the stuff that we think of as being, like, entrenched in fairy tales and folk tales was just come up with by the Victorians because they make up all sorts of things. If there's any weird stuff you read about and everybody's like, oh, this goes back so long, probably it was just to the Victorians. The idea of, like, a veil between the worlds literally was invented by them, and everybody was like, it's, like, something that's been around forever. That's not true. There was no idea of a veil between the world before the Victorians got obsessed with death. So, like, whatever. I mean, I can't blame them, but also they were lying to you. Speaking of, though, the next book I'm going to talk about is The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. This was written in the beginning of the 1900s. It's like the most traditional type of fairy story, and when you read it, it's so beautiful. This is basically the King of Elfland's daughter, who is from Elfland, travels over into our world and gets married and has a child, and then eventually goes home, but obviously time passes differently in Elfland, so her child grows up and has to go and, like, rescue his mother, and not rescue, but, like, get her back and bring her back. There's a witch in this book called Zarun Durrell, so, like, that's fun. And also a bouncing goblin thing, which almost ruins everything. So it's super beautifully written. If you want, like, a traditional fairy story, this is the place to start. That's The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. Next, I'm going to talk about the man, the myth, the legend himself, Jolkin, Rolkin, Rolkin, Tolkien. We're going to talk about The Hobbit. So, here's the thing. Speaking of people who just, like, made stuff up and now all of a sudden everybody accepts them as part of, like, folklore and fairy tales, J.R.R. Tolkien came up with a whole bunch of things that now, like, greatly affect how we think about fairy tales and how we think about, like, various, like, elves and hobbits. Like, hobbits weren't really an idea until Tolkien came up with them, and now if anyone plays D&D, that's what a halfling is, basically. Tolkien really, like, came up with a bunch of stuff. I will admit, I like the Lord of the Rings movies better than the book, but if you want something weird to watch right now in quarantine, a great thing to watch is the animated Hobbit movie, which is horrifying. The animation makes things look very frightening. Again, that's The Hobbit by Tolkien, in case any of you forgot the name of that book. Now, we're getting into the fun stuff. Now, to start us off with weird retellings of fairy tales, I'm going to talk about The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents by Terry Pratchett. This is a Discworld book. If anyone knows me in person, you know that I love Discworld. I've read all of the Discworld books. They are all so fun. There are 45 books in the Discworld series, and every single one of them is worth reading. Also, none of them are, like, some of them are connected, but you don't have to read them in any specific order. So, like, if you want to know what Discworld book to start off with, tweet at Trident Books, and I will tell you. The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents is a retelling of the Pied Piper, which is a really fascinating fairy, like, I wouldn't even call it a fairy tale, honestly. It's more of a folk tale because, my coworkers are making fun of me in the comments in case you are wondering what's happening there. The Pied Piper isn't even really a fairy tale, it's more of a folk tale, because there is actual evidence that this happened. In the records of the town of Hamelin, it's, like, the earliest record starts off with, like, it was 50 years ago or however long ago that the Pied Piper came to town and took all of our children away. So, like, a weird folklore thing where, like, you think it may actually possible. The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents, though, is about Maurice is a talking cat who convinces a bunch of rats and also a dumb child to go into towns and convinces the rats to make everybody believe that there's a rat problem, and then, like, he murdered them. Gianna, that's a great question. I don't know if the Pied Piper murdered all those children, but, like, maybe. Maurice convinces the rats to basically run a con and make towns pay for the Piper to, like, get them all out of there. It's so good. It is an underappreciated book. This one's such a fun Discworld book. It is a standalone in the Discworld universe, so you can just, like, read it and not worry about anything else, which is so fun. It's also, like, great for kids, maybe not young children, but, like, teens, probably. It is technically, I think, one of the Discworld books that is not classified as an adult book, along with the Tiffany Aching books, which is kind of weird. All of them are kind of in the same age range, honestly. But an excellent book, an excellent retelling. That is The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents by Terry Pratchett. Now we're getting into more retellings, which are always fun. I should move these books. These mass market paperbacks are going to make everything fall down. The next one I am talking about, as I knock everything over, is Sisters of Glass by Naomi Cypris. This is a middle grade book. It's a retelling of The Princess and the Pauper, or The Prince and the Pauper, technically, although to be perfectly honest, I was introduced to this fairy tale by the Barbie movie, so that doesn't seem like it should be correct. It is also a fantasy book. It is about one girl who lives in a world where magic is outlawed, who has magic, who, like, ends up making a magic mirror and going into a world where magic is allowed, but where the princess is supposed to have magic, and she meets the princess who looks exactly like her, who doesn't have magic. So, of course, they switch places and shenanigans ensue. So, highly recommended. This is a middle grade book. It's called Sisters of Glass by Naomi Cypris. Next up, also, I know I talk very fast. I've got like 20 books to go through, but if you have any questions or have comments, just jump in at any time. I'm not worried about it. I'll try to comment on everyone. If I miss yours, please don't feel bad. Probably I just wasn't reading them fast enough. The next book to talk about is The Black God's Drums by P. Djeli Clark. It's this one. This is so good. It's so wonderful. It's very, very little. But my only complaint about this book is that I wish it was 400 pages long, because everything that happens in it, I'm like, I want to know more. I want, like, every paragraph, I'm like, this could be 6 pages and I would be content with that. It's about, like, kind of a steampunk version of New Orleans where, like, Haitian folklore and Haitian gods are, like, real and have influence over all of the people, and they have to, like, I don't know. They go on a journey and have to, like, solve things and stop people from getting this, like, big weapon that was used to drive the French out of Haiti. That is The Black God's Drums by P. Djeli Clark. It's, once again, so good. This was our Trident Book Club book not too long ago. Although, to be fair, time is super fake, so, like, it might have been several months ago, and I would have no way of knowing. Next book I'm going to talk about is an anthology. It's a bunch of different, like, stories about various, like, East and South Asian fairy tales that are being retold. It is called 1,000 Beginnings and Endings. It is very good. It's so wonderful. Like I said, it's an anthology, so there's a bunch of different, like, authors represented here, but it is edited by Ellen O and Elsie Chapman, so worth checking out. Now, This next book is incredible. I read it very quickly and recommend it to everyone and try to get everyone to read it. I read this book and then immediately read a bunch of other things by this author because she is so good. That book is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Silvia Moreno Garcia is one of my favorite authors now, and this is the first book I read by her. It's kind of like a cross between Moana and Circe for adults. It is about a girl named Cassiopeia who grows up, who is living in the 1920s in Mexico in the Yucatan, and accidentally brings back the Mayan god of death, who her grandfather was keeping locked in a box. And the Mayan god of death is like, hey, so do you want to go on a journey with me so I can get back my kingdom and like become the god of death again? And then she goes on a journey with him. It's so wonderful. The plot is like very fast-paced and like very interesting. It's a road trip with a Mayan god of death. What more could you want in a book? It's also like the aesthetic of it is beautiful. Look at this cover. It's so great. And it takes place in the 1920s. Everything Silvia Moreno Garcia writes is wonderful. She has another book that came out recently called Untamed Shore, which is like a 1970s noir novel set in Baja, California. She also has a book coming out in June called Mexican Gothic, which is the most wonderful book I've read this year, I think. I told myself I was going to stop when I had 100 pages left, and then I like kept reading and was like talking out loud and like physically shaking by the end of it, to the point that my partner who was in the room with me was like, are you good? Are you like okay? And the truth was I was just very into this book, which is sometimes how it happens. Anyway, check out Gods of Jade and Shadow. I love this book and you will too, I promise. Next book is Uprooted by Naomi Novik. Naomi Novik is excellent. I personally love everything I've read by Naomi Novik, who's handling distribution. So we are distributing things. So if we have a book in store, we're shipping things out from our store. We also go through Ingram, which is our distributor, where we can like send things that we don't have in store through them right now. Yes, Uprooted is so good. It's more of traditional fantasy and, like, it's about a girl who goes to live in a tower to help a wizard and then ends up, like, stopping this huge sickness that's infecting the woods and everything. I think this is wonderful. There's so many really powerful moments in this book, and right now we have a bunch of sale copies. Naomi Novik has also written Spinning Silver, which is definitely worth reading, which is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin. Speaking of, next thing I'm going to talk about is Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. Katherine Arden has a whole series of these books. We also have sale copies at the store that you can get online. This book is so much fun. It's set in kind of like a Russian fairy tale-esque fantasy world, which I personally am really into. Russian fairy tales have this like really specific kind of aesthetic to them, which is always really fun. I don't know if any of you know the song Rusalka Rusalka by the Decemberists, but like that basically summarizes everything. The Rusalkas are a great fairy tale creature from Russian fairy tales. Also, who doesn't love Baba Yaga? If I had a house with chicken legs, first of all, it would make quarantine really interesting. You could go wherever you want and not leave your house, but not the point. The point is, I am moving on to the next book. So, the next book I'm going to talk about is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. I read this book super fast so that I could go to an event with Melissa Albert. It is set starting off in our world, and it's about a girl whose grandmother wrote like a bunch of fairy tales that get really famous in the world of the book. And then the fairy tales sort of like try to, basically they come into the real world, which is super cool. And she has to deal with that and like travel to this fairy tale world and deal with them. It also has a bunch of like fairy tales that kind of were like, she's writing her own fairy tale book of this fairy tale book. and she has to deal with all of that. It's also very cool. One of the characters in it is Twice Killed Katherine, and for those of you who weren't here for the beginning, my name is Katherine, and so I got it signed to me, to Twice Killed Katherine, which is very cute. Also, the sequel just came out, which I'm just gonna, like, breeze over because I'm still dealing with all of this. That's The Night Country, which came out in January. So you can get both of them right now. We have them on our shelves. And if multiple people want them, we can ship out multiple copies. It's great. The next book I'm going to talk about is by Daniel Lavery. That's The Merry Spinster, which is a bunch of short stories. It is really great. It's a bunch of, like, sort of horror retellings of fairy tales. But I don't know if the rest of you are like me right now, in that you can't concentrate on books, but short stories are a wonderful way to get around that, and so definitely worth reading. So, just hello to everyone jumping on. Just to reiterate, I have, let's see, like 10 more books to go through. I'm going to go through them real quick. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know, and I will try to answer them as I go. Next one is a retelling of Cinderella. Cinderella is one of my personal favorite fairy tales. When I was little, had picture books that were like various Cinderella stories from around the world. And when I say picture books, I mean each one was a separate picture book, and I had, I think, about 30 of them. So, story near and dear to my own heart. This one is called Ash by Melinda Lo, which is a retelling of Cinderella. You all know the basic story of Cinderella. I don't have to go into the whole thing with you, but this one is really fun. Any retelling of Cinderella is, I think, very fun, because at heart, it's a story about, like, getting out of shitty situations, which is always important, you know. The next book is maybe not my personal favorite on this list, but definitely close. Definitely close enough that when I went to pick it up, I almost said this book is my personal favorite on this list. So, that is, did you hear they're doing another live action Cinderella? Like Disney or like in general? Like, here's the thing. I'm gonna watch any Cinderella that they have because I usually have fun with them. But there's so many. Anyway, I feel like when you do a retelling, you should at least be able to do something fun and interesting with the story, and if you can't, then like, you're just trying to capitalize on a name. So I'm suspicious. Interesting. I'm gonna have to keep an eye out for this. Thank you, Gianna. The next book is The Archive of Alternate Endings by Lindsay Drager. This book is so good, to the point that when I was first told about this book, I was very betrayed that I wasn't told about this book earlier.
I thought I had told you!
My partner is in the room right now to make me feel like I'm not just talking to myself. Z was the one who didn't tell me about this book, and I'm still betrayed by it.
I did tell you!
Anyway,
eventually.
The Archive of Alternate Endings is super cool. It deals a lot with time. It deals with, like, the Grimm brothers. All of the stories are connected through, like, the theme of, like, siblings and the theme of queerness, and also the story of Hansel and Gretel, which is such, like, an interesting way to deal with fairy tales as, like, a fairy tale that leaves crumbs throughout the story, leaving crumbs throughout the book itself. It's so beautifully written. I don't think there's really an accurate way to talk about this book without just, like, reading the book, because the copy isn't great. I mean, it's fine. But, like, if you read the first page, either this book is for you and you read the first page and you're hooked immediately, or it's not and you're not, which is fair. But I highly recommend this book. This is one of my favorite books that I read all year. That is The Archive of Alternate Endings by Lindsay Drager. Next book I'm going to talk about, we are entering the world of Alice in Wonderland. So, earlier this year there was a big push to talk about retellings. The one I am talking about right now is A Blade So Black, if I could speak, that would be helpful. A Blade So Black by L.L. McKinney. This right here. It's very good. It's a retelling of Alice in Wonderland, which is always fun because Alice in Wonderland is a really fun idea that I think is done really well in retellings. So related to that, the next one by Sarita Cordova is Labyrinth Lost, which is, here, you can see the cover because it's very pretty. This is also Alice in Wonderland, but with Brujas, so, like, fun. Anyway, I've got about 5 books left, so if you want to jump in at any time and ask questions, otherwise I'm going to breeze through these 5 books, and then that will be the end of things. Also, make sure to, like, type your questions quickly. Usually there isn't a lot of time at the end. The next one is one of my personal favorites. Whenever people were talking about books that they should read during quarantine, this was the first book I recommended because it's personally, like, I think the most comforting book I've ever read. It is not based on a real fairy tale, but it is based on a lot of folklore and, like, comes across reading like a fairy tale. And that is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. This book is so good. It is about a unicorn who finds out she is the last one and goes on a journey to try and, like, figure out what happened. It reads like a traditional fairy tale. The very first time I read this book, I was already nostalgic about this book. It's so wonderful. There's also a movie which is, like, only an hour and, like, 30 minutes long, which is incredible. You just read that book. It makes you so happy. Any recommendations for fantasy and folklore with political themes? Yes! I personally think all fantasy, all folklore sort of has political themes. Uprooted, which I talked about earlier, definitely does. Here, I'm trying to slide it out of this pile without knocking everything over. Uprooted, also, Sisters of Glass, which was the middle grade one we talked about earlier, does. And everything Terry Pratchett does has some sort of political leanings, even if the political leaning is just that you should be nicer to people because people deserve it. So this one definitely does. Uprooted or Spinning Silver, yes, both of those have political leanings. Anyway, The Last Unicorn is, yes, incredible. The movie is so good. It's so wonderful. This is one of my go-to books that are, like, comforting. I think everyone should read it. And if you don't read it, and if you have already read it, read it again, because it is worth reading again. Now we're getting to my actual personal favorite on this list, which I couldn't say earlier because this is actually my favorite book of all time. I don't know if it technically counts as folklore or fairy tales, but I feel like it does, so I'm adding it anyway. I'm in charge here. Anything I say goes, and technically you guys can only comment on it because I am in this room just talking to you. Aaron says it definitely counts. You don't even know what it is yet. The book is The Princess Bride by William Goldman. Princess Bride is a classic. The Princess Bride is my favorite book ever. Also, I can say every single line in the movie because I have seen it so many times. I think part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this book in this particular video is the fact that The Princess Bride is, like, builds its own mythology. World building is really important in anything that, like, wants to talk about folklore and fairy tales. And part of the way William Goldman does this is by building into the narrative the idea that he is retelling the story by S. Morgenstern. So in the movie, you have the narrative of, like, the grandfather reading the story out loud, whereas in this book, it starts off as, like, William Goldman telling the story of, like, how he tried to get this book for his son and called all of these different bookstores. Meanwhile, he's at the pool trying to, like, get stuff because he's not home for his son's birthday. And Annabelle says, all in the world building. Excellent insights. Thank you. But William Goldman does not actually have a son. That is all a narrative, like, set up just to get to the story, which is the idea that he is abridging this book that he read as a child and loved, and actually it's, like, pretty boring. So you get the text itself, and then you get little footnotes by him as an aside, which, first of all, footnotes are always fun in any book. I'm a big fan. But that idea of like world building it into a story that is something that you heard. So anytime you make something sound like a story that is being passed on, it becomes almost its own form of folklore, which is why I wanted to include The Princess Bride on this list. It's an excellent book. You should all read it. If you've watched the movie and liked it, you should still read the book, because I'm telling you from the bottom of my heart, it is a wonderful book that stands separate from the movie also. I feel very much like it's like me having a friend that you know very well and you know a lot about them, and then all of a sudden you go to their home and you meet their parents and you're like, oh, this is why you are the way you are. Which like is really fun to read in the book. The next book I'm going to talk about is also not technically folklore or fairy tale, but I am, full disclosure, I am at my partner's house right now, so I don't have all of my books, which is a tragedy. I would be completely remiss not to talk about Katherine Valenti. I almost say Kat Valenti, which is just her Twitter handle and everything. On a video about fairy tales, especially because her book Deathless is one of my favorite books of all time, and it is about like, it's basically a love letter to Russian fairy tales. It's incredible. Deathless is incredible. She also wrote The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Boat of Her Own Making, which is like a fun fairy story that goes on for a few books. That's like a middle grade series. She has, all of her books are so incredible and so unique and so fun, but the book I have right now is The Glasstown Game by Katherine Valenti, once again, which is a story about the Bronte siblings as children who end up going on this magical adventure. So that's a lot of fun. Also, but to be fair, while I said it wasn't a fairy tale or folklore, technically speaking, a great way to like deal with folklore is to take real people and tell stories about them. So who's to say? Me, I'm to say. I've got 2 more books, and then if there's no questions, I'll just wrap it up. So if you have questions, let me know. The next book I'm going to talk about came out rather recently. I loved this book. It is a retelling of like Bluebeard, but in a really cool way. It takes place in Iceland in like the 1600s. So that book is The Glass Woman by Caroline Lee. It is about a woman who gets married to like somebody who's a big shot in the little village, and goes to his house and finds out that she is not allowed in the attic, and there's like a whole bunch of stuff that goes on there. Like I said, a retelling of Bluebeard, so make of that what you will. But this is like really fun. It's a fun take. It also is like, the atmosphere of this book is really well done. Yes, Gianna did recommend this book. I think I read it before that, but Gianna wrote our staff rec for this book. So that's The Glass Woman by Caroline Lee. Now, the last book is a stretch. But if we're talking about what makes folklore, I thought this was, oh wait, was it Bluebeard? It is kind of based on Bluebeard, yeah, Gianna. This last book is a stretch, but I think it's important to talk about how you build folklore, because folklore and fairy tales aren't just about the things that have lasted very long and the things that like get passed down, and you talk about things that are like fairy rings and like unicorns and stuff like that. It is also, folklore is about the stuff we build about like what we're dealing with now. So the last book I'm going to talk about today is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, which just came out. It is incredible. If you, like, the book itself is amazing, but also, if you're going to read this book, I suggest you listen to the audiobook, because it's like a full audio, like, drama recording, which is amazing. This book deals with kind of the folklore and the way we have built up cities in, like, the modern mind. The city of New York has like a personification that is broken up into the different boroughs and has to fight eldritch horror creatures, which is very cool. It's a very cool thing. I love this book. I like could not stop listening to it. And I think it is very cool to talk about this in regards to how we talk about folklore and fairy tales, because folklore and like urban myths and stuff that come up around cities and around more modern things are what are eventually going to be like the folklore and fairy tales of the future. N.K. Jemisin's ongoing comic, Far Sector, is also really great. That's, yes, agreed. Everything N.K. Jemisin writes is wonderful. I love it. There's another book. Yes. Right here. I've got the 5th season. Like, honestly, pick up any of them, but definitely listen to the audiobook of The City We Became. Once again, that was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. So I am done talking about books. I'm going to go through and read all of these titles. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, let me know. Otherwise, I will sign off. This video will be up on Trident's YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. What else besides reading have you been doing during quarantine? Gianna wants to know. Great question, Gianna. The answer is working. And also, I've been knitting a lot. I learned to knit when I was little, and so it's very fun to do. I'm trying to make a blanket for my friends. I can say that because they're not watching this and probably won't. And so, I'm going to go through this list. I have been Katherine here at Trident Books. All of these books will be available on our website, and there will be like a full list listing all of them in case you don't remember the titles. If you have any questions about things that happened tonight or things that we talked about, I will be answering them over on Twitter because I run the Twitter. What do you have on your own bookshelf that you wish you had today? Oh, I wish I had Deathless. I wish by Kat Valenti. I very much wish that I had her other book, the Orphan's Tales, which she's reading over on Instagram every night. If you go to her YouTube channel, she is like reading those for free. Her YouTube channel has all of the backlogs. She's reading them on Instagram live at 8:30, and that's like a sort of a retelling of the Arabian Nights, which is really cool. So those are the two main books that I wish that I had. Also, I am a huge fan of fairy tales in general, and would have I have 6 or 7 books of fairy tales that I love. And also, technically we're not talking about myths tonight, but Delara's book of Greek myths is my favorite Greek myth book, so I probably would have brought that up too. So all of those are things that I have on my personal bookshelf that I wish I had here and don't. Gianna says, has quarantine been messing up the book release schedules? Yes. A lot of book releases have been pushed back. It really depends on the publisher and the book. To be perfectly honest with you, mainly they've been pushing back books that they think are going to do really well, which is kind of sad. Stardust, yes, you're correct. Stardust is also one that I wish I could talk about. Speaking of wonderful movies that you should be watching. I think I actually do have that one here and just forgot about that, so thank you for mentioning it. Yes, I do. I've got Stardust right here, which I was recently reading. And actually, when I did this list, I was like, I should talk about Stardust, and completely forgot. Stardust is excellent. Neil Gaiman is a lot of fun. If you haven't read this book, you definitely should. So, that's that for that. I'm going to read through all of these, and then I will close us out, unless you guys have more questions. And the illustrated edition. Yeah, I don't think this one is the illustrated edition, although I do really love the cover of it, but Stardust is excellent. There's also an illustrated edition of The Princess Bride, which is worth getting. I may or may not also own that in addition to all of the other versions that I own. So, books I talked about are in reverse order, basically. Stardust by Neil Gaiman, The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, The Glass Woman by Caroline Lee, Glasstown Game and Deathless and The Orphan's Tales by Kat Valenti, The Princess Bride by William Goldman, The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, Labyrinth Lost by Zoraida Cordova, A Blade So Black. Every time I say this title, I have trouble with it. It's a good book. Don't be deterred by me having trouble saying the title. A Blade So Black by L.L. McKinney, Archive of Alternate Endings by Lindsay Drager, Ash by Melinda Lo, The Merry Spinster by Daniel Lavery, The Night Country by Melissa Albert, and the prequel to The Night Country, the first book in it, is The Hazelwood. Labyrinth Lost is so good. Yeah, it's so wonderful. Look at the cover of it. You just know. The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. Uprooted by Naomi Novik. Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia. A Thousand Beginnings and Endings, which is an anthology, so edited by Ellen O. and Elsie Chapman. Black God's Drums by P. Jelly Clark. The Sisters of Glass by Naomi Cypress. The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. The Oxford Classics book of Victorian Fairy Tales. And honestly, look at how pretty this book is. It's just such a nice collector's edition. Tales of the Beetle and the Bard by J.K. Rowling. The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents by Terry Pratchett. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. And Philip Pullman's take on the Brothers Grimm. So, thank you everybody for joining me for this literary cocktail hour as I talked about folklore and fairy tale. I will be back at the same time next week to talk about a different literary topic. If you have ideas, feel free to tweet them at me. And as always, stay safe and happy reading. Cheers.